Hey guys, welcome back. So today we want to talk about a Canadian-made Colt M4 carbine. You heard me right, Canadian-made. This means it was manufactured by Diemaco or Colt Canada. And you don't typically see these things in the United States. They weren't sold to the civilians. Colt never took them in and sold them on the civilian market. They were only sold to law enforcement agencies in the United States. Now, many of these law enforcement agencies are giving these rifles up, making them available on the United States market, and that's what we're going to talk about today. How can you identify a Diemaco-made AR-15 like this one? Stay tuned because we're going to give you some pretty valuable information. But before we get started with today's video, I got to find the right pocket. I have some Federal 223 ammunition. I want to thank our friends over at Federal for making the ammunition available for us here on the Military Arms channel. And yeah, let's do a little shooting with this guy. In 1994, Bill Clinton would sign into law what became known as the assault weapons ban. That ban would sunset in 2004, but through the duration of that ban, Colt would manufacture rifles that had pre-ban features for law enforcement only. The carbines would be stamped law enforcement only, and they would have an LE prefix. After the ban sunset in 2004, those markings were popular. Colt recognized that, and they would continue to manufacture the 6920 with those LE markings. And then later, Colt started to lose military contracts, stopped producing much of the guns themselves in-house, started to outsource, and then they decided a few years ago to cease the LE serial number series and go to a CR prefix on guns that are made currently. And the gun that I have here is an example of that. This is one of the Colt SOCOM rifles. This has, this is made by Colt when Colt was going through its, internal breakup, if you will, after it was losing military contracts and it had to cut back expenses. This would be a product of that era of Colt manufactured rifles. But we're going to compare that to the Canadian rifle that we have here. Now, the Canadian rifles, as I said, were manufactured for law enforcement sales only. They were never intended to be sold to civilians here in the United States. After talking to Chris at Small Arms Solutions, who's a Colt historian, he would tell me on the phone that these rifles had some easily identifiable external markings that would identify them, and they were sold directly to law enforcement agencies. They would not go to Colt and then be sold from Colt to the law enforcement agencies. They would drop ship them from Colt Canada to the law enforcement agency purchasing them, cutting out the middleman being Colt. So they never went to distribution. They never went anywhere. They were just sold to law enforcement agencies in the United States. Well, now those law enforcement agencies are moving on to new rifles, and these are getting sold on the civilian market. Now, this rifle comes from Copper. Copper just recently got a bunch of these rifles in, and they're surprisingly affordable. They are 100% Colt Canada produced, with some small parts that Colt would send up to Colt Canada to complete the manufacturing of the rifles. Small things like the carrying handle, the buttstock, things like that. But in terms of the metallurgy, the upper and lower receivers, the barrel, things like that, they were 100% produced by Colt Canada, and we'll talk about some of those differences in this video. You'll notice that the gun has the old school Colt finish on it, right? That gray parkerized look to it. When these were produced, Colt had already moved on to the dark black anodization. And you'll notice that on the carrying handle here, right? So the carrying handle was sent by Colt US to Colt Canada to complete the rifles to send to US law enforcement. And that's why it has the darker finish on the carrying handle versus the lighter phosphate looking finish on the receiver. This is an example of the Colt Black guns. This is when Colt had transitioned to the black finishes and moving away from that 80s gray, as I like to call it, when Colt had that really light gray finish to them, the US Colts. So next, let's take a look at how you can identify one of these rifles and know if you have a Canadian Colt. Now, you'll see pictures coming out of Canada of different markings that you're going to find on these guns. Keep in mind, these guns were manufactured for US law enforcement sales, so they're going to have different markings than the Canadian rifles that were sold to Canadian people, law enforcement, whatever, whoever is buying them. It doesn't have the big oak leaf and things like that you'll find on those domestically produced and sold rifles. So let's take a closer look at how you can pick one of these up and easily identify it as a Colt Canada carbine. So let's start off on the rear of the Canadian carbine and work our way forward and talk about those external markings that will quickly identify this as a Canadian manufactured Colt rifle. So if you extend the Stock on this, you're going to notice there's a taper cut right here on the extension tube. That is something that is unique to the Canadian Colts. The US manufactured Colts won't have that taper cut. We've already talked about the finish on the rifles, so it'll have that light gray finish on it, have a standard A2 pistol grip, but moving forward, you're going to notice that it has large pins. So the pin holes are larger on the Canadian Colts than on the US produced Colts. Up here, the forge markings are going to be different. They're going to find on any of the US produced Colts, not just the new, but the old. And you'll see the Diemaco marking on the forging here. And I'll show a picture of that so you know what the Diemaco marking looks like. And that's pretty much it for this side of the gun. You will notice it has the law enforcement only markings there. Coming forward, standard double shielded hand guards right here. We do have the M4 style offset for the sling swivel, bayonet lug, step cut barrel. But what's unique about the Canadian Colts, and this is not something that you can easily identify, is the fact that they're cold hammer forged barrels, something that Colt US never did. And because of that process, it didn't meet mil spec, and so Canadian barrels never found their way into military contract guns either. So that's an interesting note in history. Then out here on the barrel, you're going to see different markings than you would see on a US produced gun. You will see a CC, which stands for Colt Canada. All right, then everything else pretty much externally will be the same. Over here on this side of the receiver, you're going to notice the Colt markings. You'll notice there's no ash leaf on the side there, and everything else looks about the same, but you will notice on the markings just above the trigger guard, it says Canada on it. All right, so that's a big giveaway if you're trying to identify a Canadian produced gun. So it'll mark it very clearly on the lower, and then on the upper, if you want to confirm it's a Diemaco gun, look for the little Diemaco logo right here in the forge marking. All right, then look for the markings on the barrel, and then you can pretty much assume the rest of it's probably Colt Canada, along with that step down extension tube. Next, let's take a look inside of the gun and show you some of the markings on the internal components that will give it away as also being a Canadian produced rifle. Let's crack this bad boy open, take a look on the inside. You will have a standard H-marked buffer. Let me get that out here for you guys to take a look at. So there's your standard H-marked buffer. Don't forget those large pins that are going to be in the receiver, so you're going to have to make note of that if you decide to put in an aftermarket trigger into the gun. Take the bolt carrier out of the gun. The T-handle has no markings on it. If we take this apart, we're going to be able to see some more identifying marks on here that you're not going to find on US guns. Now, like with most law enforcement rifles, they're going to be carried more than they're shot, and so many of these are not going to have much wear on them at all. All right, so if you take a look at the bolt itself, you're going to see an MPD on the bolt. And I'll show you what the Colt US bolt looks like by contrast. Also, if you take a look at the carrier itself, it will have a Diemaco marking on there versus the C that you would have on the Colt carrier. So this identifies the carrier and the bolt as being Canadian manufactured. Not going to have any markings on the cam pin, firing pin, or the cotter pin. You're not going to find any pine needles markings on the carrier. The other thing that'll give it away is that on the staking of the gas key, you're going to see the staking is offset. On the US made guns, they'll be evenly set. They'll be more centered on the round screw head. So that also is something that will give away this carrier as being manufactured by Colt Canada. So that's pretty much the breakdown on what to look for when looking at a Canadian Colt rifle. Keep in mind, once again, these are relatively rare simply because, again, they were never intended to be sold to civilians here in the United States. A few other things to note about the rifles. First of all, they do have a 4-position stock on it. The prefix on the serial number will begin with LEC, but you'll find other prefixes out there. But generally speaking, all of these that we've seen, and there's been a couple of shipments into copper, they've all had that LEC marking on them, which sets it apart from any marking like that that you're going to see on a US produced gun. Also, you'll take note that the agencies that bought these rifles may have swapped some parts out. They may have swapped out some of the stocks, pistol grips, and hand guards. In the case of this rifle, it has its original M4 style hand guards, but only a couple of rifles came in with those. Most of them came in with Magpul hand guards. Also, this rifle has a tritium front sight post in it, and that's probably something also that the law enforcement agency that used these did to the guns. Now, this gun does have a sticker on it that says spare and then has the serial number on it. So this rifle spent most of its time in Iraq somewhere, which is probably why it didn't get all of the upgrades to it that the individual officers may have done. All right, so again, these rifles are currently available right now. They are very affordably priced when you're looking at anything that would be potentially collectible. A lot of folks won't know what these are, and there might not be a lot of collector's desire just yet for them until they trickle out and people start to realize exactly what they are and just how scarce they are. Because when you take a look at the millions of AR-15s that are on the market, having a 100% Colt Canada-built rifle is a rarity, and it's really, really cool to finally get my hands on one. All right, guys, if you enjoyed today's video, please consider becoming part of our Patreon family. There is a link in the video description below. Follow that link, and it'll take you to our Patreon page. Check out some of the perks and help support us here on YouTube. Right here on YouTube, speaking of YouTube, there is a little join button underneath the video player you're watching right now. Mash that join button and support us here in the age of demonetization. And last but not least, please swing by and check out coppercustom.com. Thank you for 14 years of support, and I'll talk to you guys soon. And just like the American-made guns, these things are overgassed.